A profound, almost unnatural stillness fell over the ravaged streets of London in May 1941. The relentless, grinding terror that had defined 9 months of life finally ceased, leaving behind an eerie void where the sirens and explosions once ruled. It was the quiet of exhaustion, a sudden, shocking absence that citizens struggled to fully process after so long. The Blitz, Hitler's savage attempt to break the British will from the sky, had run its course, ending not with a triumphant announcement but a fading of German resolve. Millions of lives had been lived under the shadow of the bomber's moon, adapting to subterranean shelters as a second home. The cessation of nightly raids was not merely a military event, it was a psychological earthquake that shifted the foundation of daily existence for every single person in the capital. For 267 days, the capital and key industrial cities had endured the most concentrated aerial bombardment the world had yet seen. The nightly ritual of fear, courage, and damage assessment was abruptly over, replaced by an unsettling but undeniable peace in the darkness. People emerged from their shelters blinking, squinting at an undamaged sunrise that felt like a miraculous, almost forgotten thing. The official end of the primary Blitz campaign came because Hitler redirected his forces toward the colossal undertaking of invading the Soviet Union, not because Britain had surrendered. This shift was a tacit, humiliating admission of failure by the Nazi regime to achieve its primary objective, the collapse of British morale. The quiet streets bore witness to the grim arithmetic of the campaign: over 43,000 civilians killed, and more than 1 million homes damaged or destroyed across the nation. Yet, amid the ruins, an unbroken spirit remained, hardened and tempered by the nightly firestorm they had faced and overcome. The debris was still everywhere, a monumental task of cleanup and rebuilding stretching out before them, but the immediate threat from above had finally receded. The quiet was the most eloquent statement of victory. It was the sound of a nation refusing to kneel. The survival of London became a legendary chapter in the global fight against tyranny, a testament to the sheer fortitude of ordinary people. This new silence held the echoes of defiant speeches and the promise of a future where true peace might one day return. The moment was heavy with both relief and the realization that the war, though changed, was far from won. The cessation of the bombing simply marked the close of a crucial, defensive chapter in the long, arduous story of World War II. The physical scars of the Blitz were immediately visible across the urban landscape, from the docks to the grand cathedrals. Whole neighborhoods had been reduced to smoking piles of brick and twisted metal, creating a new geography of destruction and loss. The emotional scars ran far deeper, etched into the collective memory of a generation forced to face death every single night. Children who had never known a world without air raid sirens were now experiencing the disorienting quiet of the war's next phase. Families were left to piece together lives from fragments, sifting through rubble for cherished possessions or desperately searching for news of loved ones. The sheer scale of the damage presented an immediate, overwhelming challenge to the government and the civilian services alike. Air raid precautions, ARP, wardens, firemen, and rescue workers who had worked non-stop for months now had a new, daunting task: recovery and repair. The end of the Blitz meant moving from immediate crisis management to the long, frustrating haul of reconstruction and continuity. Public parks and squares, once used for bomb disposal and temporary housing, slowly began the process of returning to their original, peaceful purpose. The spirit of the Blitz spirit, a term coined to describe the solidarity and mutual aid among citizens, was a defining characteristic of this period. This collective resilience was the real bulwark against Hitler's psychological warfare, proving that bombs could destroy buildings but not community. Londoners had developed a dark, witty humor about their predicament, a way of coping that Churchill himself greatly admired and encouraged. They had learned to distinguish the sounds of various German aircraft and to measure the terrifying proximity of falling bombs. The nightly exodus to the underground stations, where thousands slept in shifts along the tracks, had created a unique, temporary society beneath the city. The infrastructure of the city, its transport, utilities, and communications, had been strained to the breaking point but never completely failed. The survival of institutions like the Bank of England and St. Paul's Cathedral became powerful symbols of the nation's refusal to be conquered. The government understood that this period of relative calm was a fragile truce, and they had to quickly fortify public sentiment for the next phase of the global conflict. The collective trauma experienced by the citizenry needed validation, not just from each other but from the highest levels of leadership. This moment demanded a profound acknowledgement of the sacrifice made by the people who had endured the fire and emerged unbroken. Winston Churchill carried the weight of the nation's survival squarely on his shoulders throughout the entirety of the Blitz. He understood that his primary role was not just to direct the military strategy but to be the embodiment of British defiance and hope. During the darkest days of the bombing, he insisted on walking through the ravaged streets, making himself visible to the people in their moment of greatest suffering. His appearances were never purely ceremonial, they were vital infusions of moral courage directly administered to a battered and weary populace. Churchill's own underground bunker, the Cabinet War Rooms, served as a literal and metaphorical symbol of the government's unwavering commitment to continue functioning under attack. He saw the destruction firsthand, the gaping holes where homes and history once stood, and this informed the passionate urgency of his rhetoric. The Prime Minister knew that the transition from nightly terror to cautious optimism was a crucial moment that required careful political and emotional handling. He had to praise the endurance of the past while simultaneously steeling the nation for the future battles that still loomed across the world. The news of Hitler's eastward shift was a complex victory, a reprieve that did not signal the end of the war but merely a strategic pause in the direct attack on Britain. Churchill's genius lay in his ability to translate military assessments into poetic, accessible language that resonated with everyone from dock workers to peers. He needed to validate the suffering, celebrate the survival, and redirect the collective energy toward the monumental tasks ahead. His speeches were carefully crafted works of art, designed to inspire, inform, and infuriate the enemy all at once with their sheer conviction. The end of the Blitz was the perfect moment for a grand statement, a summation of Britain's achievement and a renewed promise of ultimate victory. He chose his words with meticulous care, understanding that they would be recorded by history and would serve as the official epitaph for a period of immense national trial. His personal life, punctuated by late nights and endless cigars, reflected the tireless vigilance required to shepherd the nation through such an unprecedented crisis. He was the voice of the lion, roaring defiance when others might have whispered compromise, which proved to be the pivotal decision of the entire war. The moment of silence was his cue to speak, to fill the void of the sirens with a proclamation that honored the dead and uplifted the living. The finality of the Blitz demanded a statement as monumental as the destruction itself, a word from the leader who had held the line. Churchill's ability to articulate the national will became the most effective weapon in the British psychological arsenal during the war. His famous speeches were not simply reports, they were acts of statecraft, forging a common narrative of shared struggle and ultimate triumph. When the bombs stopped, the primary theme of his address had to shift from immediate, defiant resistance to a celebration of sustained endurance. The end of the Blitz proved the central premise of his rhetoric, that the British people could and would take whatever punishment the enemy could inflict. His words had previously promised blood, toil, tears, and sweat, and now he had the solemn duty to acknowledge that the people had delivered on that promise with unwavering courage. He understood that the phrase he needed was one that recognized the cost but emphasized the unconquerable nature of the survivors. His message had to encapsulate the relief of the moment without fostering any illusion that the war was suddenly won and over. The phrase that history remembers him delivering was a masterful balance of humility, praise, and forward-looking determination. He paid tribute to the ordinary citizens, the men and women of the civil defense, whom he often referred to as the Home Guard and the unarmed hosts. He never sensationalized the suffering, instead using dignified, powerful language that elevated the civilian contribution to the level of military valor. The speeches delivered around this time served to officially canonize the Blitz spirit as a permanent fixture in the British national identity. Churchill utilized a vocabulary rooted in the long sweep of British history, invoking images of island defiance and the nation's perennial role as a champion of liberty. His voice, familiar to millions through the radio, provided a steady, reassuring presence that connected the government in Westminster directly to the shelters of the East End. The end of the bombings allowed him to draw a definitive line under a terrible chapter, turning a period of intense loss into an unqualified victory of will. He carefully framed the German failure not as a temporary retreat, but as a fundamental, strategic defeat of their aim to break British morale. The language was inspiring but grounded, powerful but never melodramatic, reflecting the stoicism of the people he was addressing. He made it clear that the defense of London was a contribution to the freedom of the entire world, a debt owed to them by all the subjugated nations of Europe. The end of the Blitz was a moment to pause, reflect, and gather strength, and Churchill's rhetoric provided the intellectual and emotional framework for that national moment. The final, devastating raids in mid-May 1941, particularly the massive attack on the night of May 10, provided a stark contrast to the quiet that followed. This last, brutal effort by the Luftwaffe failed to achieve any decisive strategic aim, serving only to highlight the enemy's growing frustration and exhaustion. The sudden, definitive end of the large-scale nightly bombings felt like a monumental pressure valve had been released on the entire nation. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, citizens could fall asleep without the gnawing anxiety of the air raid siren's piercing wail. The phrased end of the Blitz is historically complex, as smaller, sporadic raids continued, but the systematic, nightly campaign of mass destruction was over. Churchill's address, delivered in the immediate aftermath, was tasked with interpreting this relief and making sense of the preceding months of chaos. He had to ensure the people understood that the lull was a result of Hitler's changing priorities, not a surrender by Britain, maintaining the war footing. His words emphasized the fact that the people, through their sheer refusal to yield, had forced a major strategic change in the Nazi war plan. He lauded the spirit of London, which he proclaimed had taken the worst that could be thrown at it and had not merely survived but had ultimately triumphed. The cessation allowed the British war machine to finally focus more intently on other critical fronts, particularly the Battle of the Atlantic. The relief felt was palpable, but it was a sober relief, fully aware of the human cost and the miles of rubble that still needed to be cleared. The rebuilding effort was framed immediately as another form of warfare, a domestic battle for renewal and a display of permanent faith in the future of the nation. Churchill's genius was in ensuring that the absence of bombs was treated not as a stroke of luck but as a hard-won, tangible victory for civilian morale. He made the ordinary Londoner feel like a frontline soldier who had successfully repelled a major enemy invasion force, which was a profound truth. The memory of the dark, terrifying nights and the bright, fierce fires would remain, but the threat itself was now geographically and temporally distant. The moment provided a crucial psychological boost, proving that the period of pure defense was transitioning toward a new phase of opportunity and counterattack. The Prime Minister's voice was the sound of a chapter closing, offering both closure on the trauma and an inspiring preamble to the challenges yet to be faced. Churchill's words were a direct communication to a nation that was utterly exhausted but far from broken by the ordeal. He spoke to the weary firemen who had fought the raging infernos of the docks, their faces permanently etched with smoke and fatigue. He spoke to the volunteer nurses who had tended to the wounded in makeshift hospitals, demonstrating endless compassion and courage under fire. He spoke to the factory workers who never missed a shift, often traveling miles through burning streets to keep the war production lines moving. His message was a communal thank you, a moment of profound national gratitude that transcended mere political rhetoric. He consciously used simple, direct phrases that could be understood by everyone listening on their little Bakelite radios in shelters and shattered homes. The Prime Minister was a master of the pause, allowing the weight of his pronouncements to settle before moving on to the next soaring sentence. He emphasized the concept of the home front, turning every civilian into a combatant in the crucial, defining battle for Britain's survival. Churchill's voice was a powerful reminder that their endurance had fundamentally altered the strategic map of the global conflict. He ensured that their sacrifice was woven into the glorious tapestry of British history, placing the courage of the common man above the grand strategy of the generals. The sense of shared danger and mutual respect between the leader and the led was never stronger than at this pivotal moment in May 1941. His words were an act of psychological healing, a confirmation that their trauma was acknowledged and their quiet heroism was being justly celebrated. He warned against complacency, understanding that the cessation of the Blitz was merely a respite, not a final peace treaty with the enemy. The speech served as a powerful motivator, refilling the emotional reservoirs of a people who still had years of struggle ahead of them. Churchill focused on the future, painting a picture of final victory that made the 9 months of terror seem like a necessary, painful step on a glorious ascent. He managed to turn the ruins into monuments of defiance, transforming the destruction into evidence of the nation's unshakable will. His message to the tired, scarred nation was clear: their darkest hour had passed, and their courage had earned them the right to look forward with renewed confidence. Churchill knew the true victory of the Blitz was not military but spiritual, a profound triumph of human will over mechanical destruction. His address sought to immortalize this spirit, ensuring that the stoicism and solidarity of the populace became the enduring legacy of the bombing. He used language that spoke to the deeper values of the nation: liberty, democracy, and an innate, stubborn love of freedom. The Prime Minister's words elevated the common experience of shelter life and rubble clearing to an epic, historic achievement against fascism. He praised the ability of the British people to maintain a sense of humor and normalcy even as their world was literally crashing down around them. The defiance he had preached from the moment he took office had been validated by the collective actions of millions of ordinary, heroic individuals. He focused on the German failure, highlighting the fact that Hitler had misjudged the fundamental character and resolve of the British nation entirely. The Nazi aim was to provoke panic and civic unrest, yet the bombings had instead fostered an unprecedented, unifying wave of community and cooperation. Churchill noted that the material losses, though grievous, were temporary, while the moral capital accumulated by their endurance was priceless and permanent. He framed the survival of London as a beacon of hope for all of Europe, a shining example to the oppressed peoples living under the Nazi yoke. His tone was one of immense pride, a leader genuinely moved by the incredible grit and determination shown by those he governed. The Prime Minister's address effectively closed the emotional ledger on the period, allowing the nation to process the trauma and begin the mental shift toward offense. He made it clear that the spirit that had survived the Blitz would be the same spirit that would ultimately drive the Allies to complete and utter victory. This triumph of the spirit was a crucial propaganda point, disseminated worldwide to show that Britain was not just holding on, but was actively winning the psychological war. The moment was a powerful reminder that human values could endure the most barbaric forms of technological assault and emerge stronger. Churchill's genius was in ensuring that the people felt they were the authors of this victory, not merely the passive recipients of a strategic shift. Churchill understood that the cessation of the Blitz was a critical hinge moment in the broader narrative of the Second World War. He had to articulate the historical weight of the moment, placing Britain's survival firmly within the context of the struggle for global freedom. The shift of German forces to the east was presented not as a neutral move but as a direct result of their failure to secure a quick victory in the west. The Prime Minister's words underscored the fact that Britain's lonely stand had successfully bought precious time for the eventual entry of the United States into the conflict. He framed the end of the Blitz as the moment Britain officially moved from being a nation purely on the defensive to one actively preparing for offensive action. This was the point where the possibility of invasion, once a paralyzing fear, began to recede into the realm of historical conjecture. Churchill used the opportunity to reinforce the growing bonds between Britain and its Commonwealth allies, who had stood by the mother country through the worst. He spoke about the strategic consequences of the Luftwaffe's failure, which had severely damaged the morale and readiness of the German Air Force. The end of the massive raids freed up resources, both military and civilian, that could now be reallocated to other theaters of war. His address served as an intellectual bridge, connecting the grim endurance of the past to the aggressive campaign planning of the future. The Prime Minister was a historian in his own right, and he ensured that the contemporary moment was correctly logged as a turning point for future generations to study. He emphasized that the courage displayed in the streets of London was directly linked to the survival of free governance and democratic ideals worldwide. He skillfully leveraged the moment to appeal to the global powers, particularly the still neutral America, highlighting the strategic value of an unconquered Britain. Churchill's words transformed the rubble of London into a monument to a successful defense, a place where the tide of fascism had been irreversibly checked. He saw the silence over the city as the opening note in a symphony of future Allied victories that would eventually liberate the entire continent. The address was a profound declaration that the war's trajectory had been permanently altered by the resolve of the British people during those 9 long months. The central purpose of Churchill's message, beyond praising the past, was to articulate a clear, inspiring vision of the eventual Allied victory. He used the successful defense against the Blitz as irrefutable evidence that total victory was not merely a hope but an attainable, inevitable outcome. The Prime Minister's speeches always contained a powerful forward-looking component, ensuring the nation did not dwell solely on its recent suffering. He spoke of the necessity of maintaining the same vigilance and resolution that had allowed them to survive the aerial onslaught. The phrase, "we shall not falter or fail," became the silent promise echoing beneath the triumphant rhetoric of the end of the Blitz. He warned against the seductive danger of premature celebration, reminding everyone that the struggle on other fronts remained fierce and unforgiving. Churchill's address served as a call to rededication, asking the people to channel the energy they had used for defense into the production of war material. He painted a picture of a post-war world restored to peace and freedom, a goal that made the remaining sacrifices bearable and meaningful. The successful defense of Britain was framed as the essential first step toward the ultimate liberation of all the subjugated nations of Europe. He spoke about the importance of preparing for offensive operations, a shift in mindset that required a complete transformation of the national war effort. Churchill's capacity to connect the smallest act of civilian endurance to the grand strategy of the World War was his most powerful rhetorical tool. He ensured that every listener felt personally invested in the process of moving from mere survival to the aggressive pursuit of final victory. The relief of the moment was deliberately leveraged to inject a fresh dose of confidence and morale into the entire country's operations. He reassured the nation that their government was already planning the counterstrokes that would one day take the battle back to the enemy's heartland. The Prime Minister's voice, a steady force throughout the worst, now promised that the hardship was not in vain, but was the price paid for future liberty. Churchill's words served as the final, official proclamation of London's unconquerable status to the entire watching world. He paid homage to the city's deep history, noting that it had survived previous fires, plagues, and wars, and had emerged stronger each time. The Prime Minister ensured that the resilience of the ancient capital became a synecdoche for the enduring spirit of the entire British nation. He spoke of the way the people had cleaned up the devastation each morning, a daily act of defiance more powerful than any military maneuver. The end of the Blitz proved that the heart of the empire, despite bearing the heaviest blows, could not be stopped from beating. Churchill's words were a direct refutation of Hitler's central thesis, which assumed that the bombing of civilian centers would trigger social collapse. He praised the civil services, the police, the fire brigade, the ambulance drivers, who had kept the essential functions of the massive city running. The sheer determination of Londoners to carry on with their daily routines, even amid the rubble, was a powerful display of moral superiority. He highlighted the symbolic value of the survival of landmarks like St. Paul's, standing defiant against the flames that consumed surrounding buildings. The Prime Minister's address cemented the image of London as a city that took the worst the enemy could offer and simply refused to break or panic. He spoke of the unique atmosphere of comradeship that the shared danger had created, a temporary, beautiful unity in the face of absolute terror. The end of the nightly raids allowed the nation to fully appreciate the extent of the damage without the immediate, blinding fear of future attacks. Churchill made it clear that London had not just survived, it had effectively won the battle that determined the moral and psychological trajectory of the war. The city's endurance gave the government the necessary political stability to continue the war effort without any internal dissent or calls for a negotiated peace. The address was a final act of psychological fortification, securing the belief that the unconquerable city was now ready to look outward and assist in the conquest of tyranny. Churchill dedicated a significant portion of his address to recognizing the quiet, steadfast dedication to duty demonstrated by ordinary citizens. He spoke of the countless acts of anonymous heroism performed every night by people who simply refused to abandon their posts or their neighbors. The Prime Minister honored the dedication of the workers in essential industries, who continued to produce armaments under the constant threat of aerial attack. He praised the women who had taken over vital roles in factories and civil defense, effectively becoming the backbone of the entire home front operation. Churchill recognized that the nation's survival was owed not to any single brilliant general but to the collective, unyielding resolve of every man and woman. He used the end of the Blitz as a moment to elevate the civilian role in the war, ensuring their immense contribution was officially and publicly acknowledged. The concept of duty was presented not as a heavy obligation but as a source of immense national pride and moral strength. He spoke about the need for this dedication to continue, shifting the focus from defensive courage to the patient, persistent effort required for victory production. The Prime Minister knew that a celebrated, validated people would be better equipped to face the long, difficult years of rationing and war ahead. He emphasized that the same self-sacrifice and commitment were needed for the massive task of clearing the rubble and beginning the necessary work of reconstruction. Churchill's words gave solemn weight to the individual actions that, when combined, had created the insurmountable fortress of the British will. He ensured that the sacrifices of those who had died were not forgotten but were honored through the living's continued, dedicated pursuit of the common cause. The end of the Blitz was a moment to pause and salute the weary, faithful people whose dedication had saved the nation from immediate military and moral collapse. He made it clear that the defense of Britain was a testament to the superiority of a free society, where dedication is born of choice, not coercion. Churchill's final words on the subject of the Blitz were meant to define its permanent place within the long narrative of British history. He ensured that the 9 months of terror would be remembered not as a period of suffering but as the ultimate, defining proof of national character. The legacy he defined was one of unbreakable resolution, a story of the lion refusing to be cowed by the roaring intimidation of its enemies. The Prime Minister's rhetoric enshrined the collective experience as a national myth of survival, a shared memory that would bind generations. He ensured that the term Blitz itself would forever carry connotations of stoicism, unity, and a defiant refusal to be defeated by overwhelming force. The end of the aerial campaign was leveraged to reinforce the nation's conviction in the inevitability of total victory over the fascist powers. Churchill's message became a beacon for all future generations, a powerful demonstration that courage in the face of catastrophe is the essence of true national strength. He reiterated that the price paid was immense, but the moral and strategic victory achieved was absolutely invaluable to the Allied cause. The final statement on the Blitz was one of profound gratitude mingled with a fierce, unwavering determination to press on until all enemies were utterly vanquished. He left no room for doubt that the greatest achievement of the period was not the survival of buildings but the preservation of the democratic soul of the nation. The Prime Minister's voice closed the chapter on the aerial trial by fire, but his words launched the spirit of Britain into the next, decisive phase of the war. The legacy of the Blitz, as defined by Churchill, remains a testament to the fact that the resolve of a free people is the one force that tyrants can never successfully bomb into submission.